Hello, my name is Britton Shirley, and I'm Dean of Humanities, Fine Arts, Business, and Social Science here at WKCTC, and I'd like to welcome you both virtually and in person to our first panel of the spring in connection with this year's One Book Read. We have two fantastic panelists today talking about housing insecurity and housing inequality in the United States. Carrie Schuetpels is an associate professor at the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa, where she teaches social policy. She was a homelessness policy advisor for the Obama administration from 2009 to 2016 and was a Fulbright Scholar in 2006, awarded by the U.S. Department of State to study the East-West divide of the European Union in Copenhagen, Denmark. She holds her BA from the University of Iowa, a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University, and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Wisconsin. She is represented by Aisha Pandey Literary. I'd also like to welcome Heather Anderson, who has been the McKinney-Vento liaison for Paducah Public Schools for 6 years. During that time, she has served approximately 200 students experiencing homelessness each year. She has had the distinct pleasure of being a small part of the success of students who grow to become lovers of books, advocates for social change, high school graduates, workforce partners, and college students. She is the founder of School and Transition Assistance for Youth, STAY, an organization within Paducah Public Schools that serves and empowers youth in care and those experiencing homelessness. She's a devoted coffee drinker, an enthusiastic participant in shenanigans, mischief, and revelry. All right, so I'm going to get out of the way because we have two people that are way smarter than me ready to talk to you all this afternoon. So we'll start with Carrie. Take it away, please.
Hello, everybody. So thank you for the introduction. So one of the things that I was asked to come talk about today is how I sort of got involved and interested in housing and homelessness and all of those sorts of issues. And the answer is I fell into it, which I think is important because sometimes, especially when we're studying and we're pondering what we're going to do after we finish our studies, we feel like there has to be a really specific pathway. And I'm here to tell you that there doesn't. I ended up getting my master's and being really interested in social policy. And I wasn't particularly picky about what that meant. I just knew that I wanted to do something that involved helping people. And so when I got the job at HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development in DC, I sort of started in one office and jumped around a little bit. And then I found the homelessness office, and they were just fantastic people, some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, some of the most passionate people I've ever worked with. And so that sort of led me down the path that I followed, which is trying to find good, smart people who were also good mentors, and letting the journey sort of go from there. So I spent a lot of time thinking and working on homelessness policy. With that, of course, comes affordable housing. You can't kind of do one without the other. And so that really became my area of expertise. Now that I teach at the University of Iowa, I try to teach classes that are a little bit broadly focused on poverty, thinking about social policy and poverty policy, but with a particular bent towards housing and homelessness. I think that housing is at the epicenter of so much that happens in the poverty space. If you don't have good sort of reliable housing, everything else becomes difficult. And so what I like about thinking about housing is that it's so important in the grand scheme of things for people. I am going to show you a little presentation, which I hope you enjoy. I know when we hear PowerPoint, we have a tendency to like jump out of our skin because sometimes they're very boring. Hopefully this one is not, but I thought that I would talk to you a little bit about affordable housing and sort of what that means. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. And hopefully this works. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, can I get a verbal, yes, I can see this from somebody? Heather or somebody else, can you just say yes?
We've got a no right now, but we're working on it.
Okay.
I see it on my screen.
Okay.
We just got to put it on the big screen back here. There we go.
You can see it now?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. So this is just sort of a basics to affordable housing. For some of you, this may be all stuff you know, and so just bear with me. But one of the things that's really confusing about housing and housing assistance is just simply what is the process of getting it, right? And so this is a very simplistic kind of chart that helps you understand how does someone actually receive housing assistance. And this would be through the federal government. So things like Section 8 and public housing and things like that. The first question that you have to ask is there available? Now, typically the answer is going to be no. Most communities have a wait list for this sort of thing. It's actually pretty rare to walk into a housing authority and to have them say, why, yes, we have lots of housing available. And so the first question is just simply, is there housing available? If there isn't, but you qualify, then you're put on a waiting list, okay? And that list, the length of it varies quite significantly across communities. If there is housing available and you do qualify, then you receive affordable housing. You receive some sort of subsidy. But you must meet the qualifications, right? And this is what becomes really tricky for a lot of folks is kind of trying to navigate what are those qualifications? Do I meet them? How do I figure all this stuff out? In general, these are the major qualifications. So in general, you've never committed a felony, you're not on the sex offender list, you're at least 18, you have eligible immigration status, which does not necessarily mean you're a citizen, but have permanent residency. You've never been evicted or terminated by a housing authority. You've never put false information on a housing application. And then you must meet special sort of populational requirements that the housing authority may have in place. Now, this is a very long list. And as you might imagine, a lot of people cannot check all of these boxes. And so that's what becomes really challenging is trying to make sure that all of the qualifications add up and line up, and then there's housing available, right? And then I can afford it. I mean, there are a lot of sort of steps that are really tricky in the process. And then there are financial considerations, right? So we just saw sort of the qualifications, but you also must qualify financially. And how you do that is each community, each county generally, has its own median income calculation. So in Paducah, you have a median income, and it's calculated by HUD and by other sort of federal entities. And it represents roughly the midpoint of your region's income distribution. Now, that income distribution is based on family size. And so, of course, if you're in a one-person family, then it's going to be lower than if you're in a four-person family. But wait, there's more. In order to qualify for subsidized housing, your family must earn under 50% of that number. And so you have to figure out what is the number and then divide it in half. And then if you make under that amount, then you qualify based on the financial side. Now, this information is not easy to find. Trust me, I've looked for the last few days to try and figure out what your community has for its numbers. And so typically the way that you would figure this out is actually going into the housing authority and getting the numbers from them. Now, in terms of types of affordable housing, I think that this is important because it's confusing, frankly. And a lot of this becomes sort of this maze of like, what's the difference between this thing and this thing? And so in general, most communities have a few different types of housing that is subsidized by the government. The biggest, by far, is called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, also known as Section 8. And that's basically a private market housing option where you get a voucher from your housing authority and you can take it to a landlord and say, here's my voucher, I'm going to pay X, and the housing authority pays the remaining balance. So it's any apartment really that meets the financial requirements for the housing authority, and you can go onto the private market with that. Public housing, as opposed to the Section 8 program, is actually a building that's owned by the housing authority. So it's not like you are going out into the world and having a conversation with a landlord and trying to negotiate. This is really place-based housing. There are also scattered site public housing, and you may be familiar with these different kinds of housing options. I'm not really sure what your community's housing, subsidized housing looks like, but typically there are large public housing buildings and then there are smaller ones. Usually they're like 2 to 4 units. And by the way, these are actual examples of this. And so this one comes out of Minneapolis. Same idea, owned by the housing authority, just a smaller building. And then lastly, we have a lot of special purpose housing. And so this would be housing for seniors, housing for people with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This building in Orlando that I have here, I believe, is housing for the elderly. And those, again, are buildings that are owned by the housing authority, but you must qualify based on whatever standards they are. Here in Iowa City, we have a pretty large elderly housing building, and you must be 55 and older to live there. The challenge with this kind of housing, though, is that it's not infinite, right? We can't serve everyone because we just simply don't have enough money. And that's what becomes really problematic. And when we talked earlier about waiting lists, this is why we have giant waiting lists, especially in really large cities, is because we can only serve a small fraction of all of the people who qualify. So for the Section 8 program, for example, it's estimated that 20 million families qualify for that, just based on those qualifications we looked at earlier. And yet only about 2.2 million are receiving aid. So it's a very tiny percentage, right? And therein lies the problem, is that the people who really need this assistance are not getting it usually. And I think that we saw that in a lot of the stories in the book, people with housing insecurities, and this is where we find a lot of people who unfortunately end up in homelessness, is because we just don't have enough of these subsidies to give everyone. Some examples, these are extreme, but some examples this is from 2016. 2,600 people applied for 18 homes in San Francisco through subsidized housing. 58,000 people applied for 105 homes in New York City, and 300,000 people were placed on the waiting list in Chicago. So the situation is pretty dire. Yes, these are the 3 largest cities in the country, but I think across the map, this is really kind of what we're seeing, is that we just simply don't have enough affordable housing. I thought it might be kind of interesting, and unfortunately I can't get any feedback from you, but hopefully you'll play along, which is just asking some basic questions and seeing what our guesses are for this. So my first question is, what is Paducah's median income for a family of 4? So we talked about that area median income thing. And so again, what that means is just the middle point in the distribution of incomes in your community. So for a family of 4, what do we think the middle point is, sort of the average that families are making? I'll give you a second just to contemplate that. And the answer is $63,600. Now that might sound like a high number, but keep in mind that, again, in order to first of all, this is a family of 4, and so probably you have 2 people bringing in income, maybe not, but you might. But also keep in mind that in order to qualify for subsidized housing, your family of 4 needs to make under half of that number. So in this case, you would need to make under $31,800. That would be half of your area median income, again, for 4 people. Just for comparison, if you're curious, the national area median income is about $79,900. So we're roughly $15,000 less than that in the Paducah area. Question 2, what is the average rent for a 3-bedroom in Paducah? Maybe you yourself know this very deeply and personally because you rent a 3-bedroom apartment. I can tell you, at least in my community, Iowa City, where we have lots and lots of college students, the rent is just like astronomically high. And so sometimes that can impact it. But for a 3-bedroom apartment or home, house in the Paducah area is about $922 per month, which is about $11,000 per year. And that's about 34% of our family of 4's take-home pay if they're earning that 50% of AMI. Hopefully this isn't too complicated. And so it's actually not that high of a number. In some communities, in my own community, for example, where again we have college, a giant university that kind of inflates those apartment numbers, this number is much higher. 34% is actually a pretty good range. Question 3, and we've talked about wait lists, right? What happens when you have more people who need housing than there exists housing? What is the wait for Section 8 in Paducah? I will tell you that I called your housing authority to get this number. And so this would be just for the Section 8 program. If you were to walk in today to the Paducah Housing Authority, how long approximately would you need to wait in order to get that voucher? And the answer is 6 months to a year. It's not high by national standards, but to a person, that's a long time, right? What am I going to do for a year without housing? And that's what a lot of people have to unfortunately contemplate. According to your housing authority, you have about 205 families currently on the wait list. And so they expect that that's about 6 months to a year of a wait. So again, it's hard. It's hard to figure out, well, what am I going to do in that time? I can't afford private market housing. Is there other aid available? Those are the sorts of questions that people have to contemplate. As in comparison, what's the average wait time for Section 8 in New York City? You can imagine that it's much, much higher, but curious just in terms of the scale of this, and the answer is 7.7 years. So if you were to walk into the New York City Housing Authority right now and qualify for Section 8, you'd be waiting about 7.5 years for assistance. At that point, it becomes a little bit futile because obviously you have to find housing between now and 7 years from now. And so this really, I think, just further illustrates the point that there is just simply not enough housing in this country for people who are earning below that median income calculation that we looked at earlier. So I'm going to attempt to get out of this. Hopefully, okay. Hopefully I'm back. So I think that, in terms of how I think about housing, in terms of the connections back to the book that we read, which by the way I loved, what I think about is just we don't have enough of it. And so my sort of ongoing efforts from a policy perspective is thinking about how might we serve everyone who needed housing in the same way that we serve, for example, everyone who qualifies for certain programs receives the assistance. That's just simply not how housing works, but could it be? And so I think that those are really important questions to ask, at least from a policy perspective. I'm really excited for questions later, but I think that's where I'm going to stop and turn it over to Heather.
That was an awesome presentation. I liked that a lot. So I work for Paducah Public Schools. I am the McKinney-Vento liaison, meaning I work with students experiencing homelessness in our school district. I serve students from pre-K all the way through high school. I also work with students who are attending college. Every year we serve just over 200 students. This year we're at about 140, which is low by past year standards. Students are identified as experiencing homelessness in a school district based on whether they are sharing housing, they live in hotels, motels, they are unsheltered, or they are living in transitional shelters. My job is to break down barriers to education for students. And a lot of times it's not easy to see and hear the stories of the experiences of our students. 200 is a large number for a city of our size. Really, I'm going to move on to, I'd like to say some things about your awesome presentation, Carrie. Here in Paducah, a person has to make about $17 an hour to be able to get housing. And that's for housing only. That doesn't include trash pickup or water bills, light bills, things like that. I think Paducah does have a deficit of housing. We have folks who are living on a benefits cliff, meaning they may have a job and they're offered a raise, and they have to decline the raise because they could lose their income-based housing. They lose their SNAP benefits. That raise will not cover the cost of living for them. I'm going to move on to some things about the book that were really poignant to me. But one thing I forgot, Carrie, I fell into this job just like you did. It just happened. I don't have any kind of amazing, heroic, or idyllic story. My friend was working in this position and invited me to come help, and it stuck, and I love it. Been here for 6 years, and it's just incredible. So I paged through the book again this morning, and something that I had overlooked originally was in Looking for Home by Karen Russell. She had mentioned a tornado and said, what if I told you a tornado had ripped through a town? And that it slapped me in the face today, because that happened to us. We have neighbors who are in a very serious housing crisis right now. We don't have enough emergency shelters. I feel like we weren't ready for an emergency of that magnitude. And students from those areas are coming to us, and we're doing our best to serve them through their difficult time. Trying to think of other things to say after Carrie's amazing presentation. She did great. I'm gonna move on to, I had been asked the question about how issues like this are downers, and what are things that the audience can do or be aware of. What can we do to be a part of the solution? And I'll refer back to the book, Soup Kitchen by Ann Dillard. She said, she was talking about the despair of, being an artist or an author or whatever. And she said, go work in a soup kitchen, give blood, and having fed a stranger or saved a life will really give meaning to you. And that really hit home for me, that we daily go through our lives without thinking about the suffering of others. And I think what it's going to cost time and money for us to help solve this problem. Something locally that can be done is we have a warming center here in town, and we really need volunteers there. We need help to serve this population. One thing that really, really hit home for me in the book, The Worthless Servant by Ann Patchett. She said, homelessness is an exhausting and dangerous state of being. And I couldn't agree with that more. And right before she said that, she talked about the sweetness of the men that they were visiting. And that too is just a perfect description that folks experiencing homelessness are humans too and may need our help. And let's be there for it. And I'm going to end there so we can have questions.
All right, I'm told it was hard to hear me with the mask on, so I'm a ways away from everybody. So hopefully this helps. So first off, I'll turn it over to the audience and see if they have some questions in a second, and then I'll figure out how to navigate the questions on YouTube. But just a question I had for I thought Heather, you did a nice job of talking about local things we could do in our own community to help. Carrie, on a national level, I know you mentioned those dire situations in San Francisco, New York, Chicago. On a national scale, are there any cities or communities that are doing this well, that have kind of, for lack of a better word, figured out how to provide good affordable housing?
It's a great question. The Debbie Downer answer is that, of course, the budget is always a restriction, right? You can only do so much with the money that you're given. I think what a lot of communities are figuring out is that they need money beyond what the federal government can give them. And so they're trying to incorporate private money, in some cases, local money. They're trying to get more landlords on board. It can be a really challenging conversation to have with a landlord to say, hey, we've got some folks who were previously experiencing homelessness and now they need a place to live. And there's a lot of times there's a lot of judgment, frankly, there. And so just trying to figure out how to partner with their local partners. I would say, and this is circa 2015, when I was last working in the federal government, a community that we always brought up as best practice was Houston. They have done some incredible things locally to try and serve as many people as they can. I showed you the 3 cities. Houston would be the 4th, right? So I think Houston's the 4th largest city in the country. And yet they've managed to not have a waiting list of 10 years, right? Like they've managed to really try and use what they have available to serve as many people as they can.
Heather, do you have any thing to add? Are there? I know you mentioned the warming center. Are there any other organizations or places in town that you think our community needs to know about that are helping be part of the solution here?
Absolutely. Our Paducah is an incredibly giving, thoughtful city. We have Paducah Cooperative Ministry. They administer Fresh Start Women and Children's Shelter. They do an incredible job. We have a Family Service Society, who they help families with basic needs, with medication, glasses, dentures, just things that people need to be a human and to be healthy. We just Salvation Army. We have so many incredible. I don't want to name them all off because it will take an hour. We have such great organizations in our town. Washington Street Baptist Church with the Warming Center, they host that for our neighbors in need. And I would like to also give kudos to our housing authority, because they are just constantly grinding to get people in. And like Carrie was saying, trying to recruit landlords to be Section 8 landlords. But it's a difficult thing to do.
Anybody from our feedback there? Anybody from our audience have any questions? I don't see that we have any questions. We got
about Heather's experience with college students, if she could explain a little bit more about that, since that's pertinent to us.
Okay. We had a question from the audience. I'll repeat just so everyone can hear. Heather, you did say you worked with college students, so we'd like to hear a little bit more about that, as I'm sure and hoping that those students come to us. Talk a little bit more about how the needs they particularly face and maybe things we can do as a college to help them.
So first of all, hats off to WKCTC because you serve my students very, very well. When a student graduates and they let me know they're going to college, as time passes, I can write a verification letter if they are still experiencing homelessness, which helps on their, with Pell Grants and things of that nature. Your campus provides, you've got the food pantry there, which is, just incredibly powerful for, pretty much any college student. But WKCTC, I know that you all check on my students, and I appreciate it so much. I just want to make sure, because the college is almost an unachievable goal for students who are, in poverty. And that it could be a matter of $200 that knocks them out of the running because they can't afford books, or there is a deposit for housing. And if we can stay in touch and I can write that letter for them, then that usually helps them be able to maintain their college career.
Carrie, on a national level.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
Which is, as Heather was talking, I was looking and she mentioned it, that you have a food bank, which is awesome. Another thing that I've seen happen across different campuses, including here at Iowa, is a clothing place. So if a student has an interview, right, and they don't have an appropriate outfit to wear, or that sort of thing, it can be really helpful for the campus to have some place where people can donate. What I've seen happen is a lot of professors donate their wardrobe when they realize I don't need this many suits. And so students can kind of come in no questions asked, and look through all of that and try and find something that might work for those situations. So that can be another good step forward.
So I just wanted to share that our advising center is in the process of launching one of those in the coming weeks and months. We have one advisor who specializes in career services, and he's launching them.
So just to repeat, because I'm not sure how tech's working, but we are working on starting our own clothes closet here. So hopefully that is supposed to be up and running shortly.
That's great.
Just thinking about the connection between higher education and homelessness. I heard Heather say a lot of people in that situation think it's an unattainable goal. So it just makes me think, in both of your own experience, that correlation between higher education or not achieving higher education and homelessness from a young age, like how hard that must be, if you're experiencing housing insecurities from a very young age, to even think about what's going to happen 18 years from now or 15 years from now, when you're worried about what's going to happen next week. So what are some things that you think people can do to help people in that situation realize that, this is a long-term project in getting secure housing or making your way out of poverty? I'm asking you to be psychologists, I guess.
I wish that every place had someone like Heather, who is not only working with the K through 12 population, but beyond. There are so many students who even find their way into higher education and then realize, well, wait, I don't have stable housing. I can't apply to live in the dorms because I don't have enough money. I don't understand how these applications work. I mean, anyone who's ever looked at the FAFSA, it's like written in a different language. It's just so hard to navigate. And what we see, at least here at Iowa, is so many of our students are first generation college students. I think it's about 33% of our undergraduate population. And although that doesn't inherently mean anything, sometimes what that results in is that our students don't have anyone in their support system that has gone through these processes before. And so they too have never looked at a FAFSA. They too don't know what the qualifications are for, can I get SNAPS assistance when I'm a college student? Can I receive, and it's really hard. And so I think that colleges need to do a better job of supporting their students in that way. I mean, there's a McKinney-Vento liaison in all public schools K through 12, but could there be one in every college? I mean, could we have some sort of system where these students are supported by a person, which is really important.
Tennessee passed legislation maybe a couple of years ago where McKinney-Vento liaisons were at the college level too. And as I think about a solution to this, I go back to the book, Youth from Every Quarter by Quaid, and how she was working at a private school. And it's really about advocacy for students who are experiencing homelessness or are in poverty situations. And it's about us forging a relationship. Like Carrie, you said, we've got to have a person who's going to get in there and fight and dig for these students.
A lot of students also are just not forthcoming with that information, right? They're embarrassed, or they just feel like no one cares or can help them. And so I have had many situations where my students have come back after they've taken my class and said, you didn't know this, but I was experiencing homelessness when I was in your class. And it's sort of like, if we can get students to feel more comfortable sharing that kind of information, and not necessarily with their professors, but maybe with their advisors or whoever it is in their circle. I think that would be really helpful too, because sometimes it's just simply not possible to know. It's like, well, how do we even know which of our students needs this kind of support?
Yeah, we're trying to uncover hidden homelessness.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Well, Carrie, Heather, thank you so much for spending this time with us this morning. It was thought-provoking to hear everything you had to say, but also uplifting to hear that there are good people out there doing good work, and that if we all just chip in a little bit, we can chip away at this problem. So again, thank you so much for joining us online, for joining us in person. If you're local, please check out all of those resources that Heather mentioned. I'd like to thank the One Book Committee for helping get this organized. I know Amelia Martin's reached out to get all this organized for y'all. I'm just the person here talking to the camera. So thank you all, and we have some upcoming events that you'll hear more about later this semester, so please tune in for those as well, and have a good day.
Thank you.